actually, for the first book, I had this great conversation with Archbishop Wensky of here in South Florida, and he went into this entire idea of kind of natural rights. And, if you frame it that way, if you ask the question of what is somebody's natural rights, it's to live, right? To be able to live to their fullest potential, ensure their children and their families are safe. And, I mean, look, when somebody's natural rights are violated, they are going to move to another place so that they can be safe. They can move to their fullest potential. And that, that's the inherent tension of any government, right? Is the rights bestowed by a government versus the natural rights of any one human being. And, I think we just have to kind of, you need systems that can operate in that tension. And right now, the immigration system, it avoids that tension completely.
This is the Liberated Podcast. I'm Nick Jiménez. I'm ready for Michael Beltran to see this and give me shit about reading basically a script that I wrote for myself. Immigration is a perennial hot-button topic in American politics and the broader American culture. In recent years, the debate over whether and how to allow migrants into the United States has taken on new wrinkles. The Trump presidency, the COVID-19 pandemic, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine are just some of the latest forces to push this controversy into the hottest spots of our national discourse. Ali Noorani, who's sitting right here next to me, post wedge salad at Chug's Diner. Thank you, Chug's Diner, for letting me do this.
It's a fine salad.
There you go. Ali Noorani is the CEO of the National Immigration Forum. The first time that I met and spoke with Ali, he had just published his first book, There Goes the Neighborhood, How Communities Overcome Prejudice and Meet the Challenge of American Immigration. We did an interview for the DADE Podcast, which is no longer a thing, but which I will republish in the Liberated Podcast feed for anyone who wants to hear that as background information. Right now we have a great hip-hop playlist as background. I think most, if not all, of that conversation, and in fact that book, still holds up. Ali's just published a new book, Crossing Borders, The Reconciliation of a Nation of Immigrants. Ali, thanks for joining me here.
Thank you very, very much for having me. Good to see you.
And letting me put a microphone in your face for a third time, which is just a silly thing for any person to do. So we'll talk a bit about the book, and then spend the lion's share of the conversation talking about ideas of immigration as they relate to freedom, which is part of that's kind of the deal here. This is all conversations about how we understand, secure, and exercise freedoms. But before any of that, I want to touch on a subject that a lot of people have sort of been flooded with, and that I know that you've been following more closely than most of us have time to in real time. So, apropos of just that, I don't want to ask you, summarize the whole Ukraine refugee thing for me, but rather tell me about how you've experienced that story, and where your focus has been throughout. Like, when was that not so much on your radar, because I think the issue of Russia and Ukraine has been on the but when did it really become a focus for you, and what's the arc, so to speak, of your view of it look like so far?
Sure. So let me actually go back to last summer, because under this administration there have been a lot of really landmark events when it comes to immigration, in terms of surges of people seeking protection and freedom. First, it was last summer when you had the evacuation of 80,000 Afghan allies, and that evacuation and then resettlement in the U.S. has by and large been led by the veterans community, and then the resettlement and kind of refugee organizations came in behind that. And it's pretty remarkable, because you saw and continue to see an outpouring of support across the country and across kind of the political spectrum for Afghan allies. But, we often forget about this, is that about 2 months later, we saw about 10,000 Haitians come to the U.S.-Mexico border seeking protection. And I know it's really important here in, South Florida, what Haiti as a country faces, but much less Haitians who are seeking protection. And we turned them around. We expelled them, by and large, back to Haiti, even if they had left Haiti 10 years ago.
Right.
So then you get to Ukraine, and 6 million people displaced. Majority of them have left the country. Majority of them are in Eastern Europe and are now slowly filtering across Europe and across the country. I think what it brings into clear relief are two things. One, anybody can become a refugee much more quickly than I think we realize. And number two, the fact that our current refugee resettlement system was really established after World War II. I think looking at Ukraine and everything else that's happening around the world, it is pretty clear that the system that we have that was built 60, 70 years ago is not living up to the moment.
And in what way would you say that? So I know a little bit about what the refugee resettlement system looks like, especially what it looked like in about 08 and 09, because I did some reporting on refugee resettlement in the Midwest back in college. And I was especially interested in it just given the Cuba angle. So in what way would you say that structurally or systemically it's not up to the task now?
Sure. So some of it's a numbers game. Another parts of it is just a pure capacity piece, right? So from a numbers perspective, at the end of the Obama administration was when we finally saw the U.S. starting to kind of step forward and say, as a country, we were going to welcome and resettle a reasonable amount of refugees, given the fact that we are ostensibly the most powerful nation in the world. So at the end of the Obama administration, it finally got up to about 125,000 was a ceiling. Under the Trump administration, they whittled away at that number down to about 15,000 when he left office. And what happens as a result is that, number one, we as a country are not stepping forward and meeting the need. But number two, when the number gets pushed that low, all of the infrastructure, whether it's community-based organizations, churches, much less the federal government, is hollowed out. So you have your infrastructure issue, and that's driven by numbers. And then on top of that, you actually have a system that isn't necessarily understanding kind of why people are becoming refugees. It's very clear why a Ukrainian is a refugee. It's not so clear why somebody who is fleeing MS-13 in Honduras should be a refugee, because that's not state-sponsored persecution. So another part of this is really just the definition of what it means to be a refugee.
And that's something that I want to get into, not necessarily at the end, but what I want to do from here is go through the book and for just a little bit, certain parts of the book, and then we'll get into some of those broader themes of freedom and liberty. And I think that's where some of that, I'm especially interested in talking about it in a more conceptual sort of way. So I want to start with reading a paragraph from the preface of the book. Over the years, on the front, and by the way, I just want to note, I have the manuscript. I don't know how much of this might have changed.
Not a big change.
Okay.
Maybe some typos here or there.
Great. Over the years, of
course.
What we've got here is some of. Look at this. This is there's some extra stuff going on. Oof. Thank you so much.
Oh, wow.
So I got guava and cheese, frita with the yucatecas on top, picadillo, and this one is PBJ. And then we have black bean, short rib, and ham.
Awesome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Enjoy, guys.
The perks of having a relationship with the restaurant. I asked for like maybe 3 or 4 of these things.
Well done.
Again, thanks to Chug's Diner on Main Highway in Coconut Grove. Okay, so and by the way, feel free to munch on whatever. We can do all sorts of cutting and
Sounds
all
good.
that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Over the years, on the front lines of the immigration debate, I have seen how the issue brings out the best in people. Unlikely allies, peaceful rallies, courageous immigrants, dedicated lawmakers. I've also seen how the issue can bring out the absolute worst in people, from the local to the national to the international. So, of course, you get into more detail about this in the book.
Yep.
But tell me a bit about examples of that, since you've finished writing the book, right? So just to not give away too much of what's in the book, right? So in the time since you finished writing the book, are there instances that come to mind that sort of illustrate that of the issue bringing out the best and the worst in people?
Yep. Well, I mean, let's talk about what's happening in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. In November of last year, Lukashenko, who's the president of Belarus, he, with Putin in the background, devised a scheme where Belarus would recruit Syrian refugees, or I should say Syrians, Afghans, others from the Middle East, and say, okay, we'll fly you to Belarus, and then from Belarus, we'll get you into Poland. Because once you're in Poland, then you're able to really enter the European Union. And what happened is that the weaponization of immigrants from the Middle East by Belarus led Poland and Hungary to push back people with really incredible force. I mean, there was, water cannons. People were arrested. And at the end of the day, in November of last year, it was very clear that the authoritarians of Lukashenko and Putin were trying to figure out how do they use immigrants as a political weapon. And Poland and Hungary, they refused to allow people to enter the country, but in doing so, they also dehumanized and I think treated these individuals pretty cruelly. Then, fast forward to where we are now, and as you see millions of people fleeing Putin in Ukraine, you see Poland and Hungary both saying, okay, we will welcome you.
Yeah.
So in the very same places, the very same countries, you see both the best of humanity in terms of providing Ukrainians protection, but also the worst in terms of treating the folks from the Middle East who were kind of manipulated by Lukashenko.
Yeah. Yeah, these tyrant people are the worst. It's interesting that you answered that way, because when I read it and of course this is just the preface of the book, right? So It's not like that's the meat of the book. But when I read it in the preface and then as I was going through the book, I sort of understood that to be more about the best and the worst in people in the general public, right? Because the state actors are sort of this like weird amalgamation of attitudes and sometimes act in ways that don't really reflect any. Did I read it wrong, or do you think it also
you're
applies
absolutely
that
right.
way?
You're absolutely right. And I mean, at the end of the day, even in a place like Poland, you had people who were really, motivated by the way their state actors behave when it comes to immigration. So I imagine in both in Poland and Hungary, you saw the same cases of the same person who was very happy to push back Afghans, also very happy to welcome Ukrainians.
Sure.
And that's the really the big challenge that comes with immigration is that there's a lot of there's a cognitive dissonance oftentimes.
Yeah, and sort of flipping the question on you a little bit, even though I asked it to begin with, but I'm going to flip it away from other people and on to you. Given how deeply engaged you are on that subject, I wonder whether there are ways that maybe you've observed that in yourself, right? Are there ways that being so deeply engaged with the subject of immigration you found bringing out the best and worst in you? And how have you, I think it's easier to respond to for yourself, right? How have you responded to that when you see it bringing out something good in you and whatever the worst might be? How do you deal with that?
So I think, a lot of our strategy at the National Immigration Forum, in fact, our strategy at the National Immigration Forum is very much to engage conservatives and moderates in the immigration debate. And what that means is that, as an organization and as staff, we are sitting with people, institutional leaders or people at a grassroots level, asking them what their fears and anxieties are when it comes to immigration, and then trying to help them kind of think about the issue differently. I feel like for me personally, I am at my best when I am providing ways for people to think differently and offering them a level of grace as they're changing their minds, right? Yep. I'm not going to sit down and be angry with somebody, as opposed to and I mean, look, anytime on any issue when we sit across the table and there's a deep disagreement, your blood pressure goes up, right? Yeah. So I just think that for all of us, doesn't matter kind of where we are on the political spectrum, is you need to kind of step back and provide people grace as they're changing their mind.
One of the things, and we talked about this a bit before we started recording, one of the things that I think you do really well, not just in the book, but generally in the way that you engage on this issue, we talked for the DADE Podcast, you were on Pangkong Podcast for about 30 hours of podcasting. but is generally how you deal with the subject of immigration. Is you treat the work with a very sort of human touch. You know, and I get the sense that that's very important to you. I imagine to the forum as well. So that goes both for the way that you communicate and that you seem to be very deliberate about bringing those aspects of the story into the book. So I'll read a passage here from the book. I think this might be from the first chapter. In the late afternoon sun of February 2019, by the way, this is a longer passage, so if you want to eat a croquette, go for it. In the late afternoon sun of February 2019, an elderly woman swept the front of her home with the stereotypical pride of suburban America. Head down, she moved with purpose. A small cloud of dust rose from the ground. She stood as straight as the broom she held. This was her home. This was her community. Yet this was not suburban America. This was an unpaved road that cut through a Bordeaux, a slum of San Pedro Sula, Honduras. Small houses, some of cinder block, others of corrugated metal, leaning against simple wood structures, lined both sides. The Bordeaux itself sat just above a riverbed, strewn with trash. One could see just beyond the houses. It did not take much to imagine the damage that could be inflicted by the torrential rains that regularly pummeled Honduras. The elderly woman's home sat alongside this road. Her front yard was the road we bounced along in Turismo, the ironic name of our dusty white bus of immigration advocates from the United States. Our delegation had traveled from Houston, Texas, a city with a 2017 GDP per capita of $64,824, to arrive in Honduras, a country with a GDP per capita of $2,210.59. In our effort to learn about the root causes of Central American migration to the United States, we expected a sense of fear and hopelessness to run through our meetings. Instead, we met people of determination, focus, and pride, who wanted more for their country, who didn't want to leave their homes, but were leaving because of the failure of institutions in Honduras and the United States. So setting aside your feelings about that audition for your audiobook, tell me a bit more about... I'm sure that you had tons of these sort of vignettes to pull from. How did you go about choosing them, right? And I'm curious about... it's sort of the same question, but I'm especially curious about, as the writer in me wants to know, whether you felt more of a tug of your mission or of the narrative, right? Because I know that there's so many times that there's this like really compelling story that doesn't quite fit where you're trying to go with the book, and you kind of find yourself wishing you could put it in there. So talk about the process, and maybe there's a story that was left on the cutting room floor, so to speak. Yeah,
so that's a great question. So I did a couple of trips to Honduras in 2019. The first, which was this one that you just read about, was to San Pedro Sula, and the second one probably about 4 or 5 months later to Tegucigalpa, and then to the Coffee Highlands. And in each place, I would work with a local organization who would kind of like take me from place to place, right?
Yeah.
And you know this from your reporting days, right? You sit down with somebody for an hour, and there's like you get the 3 minutes where it's like, okay, that's the thread, right? Then you kind of pull that thread, and there's a kind of an arc to it. What I often find in kind of when I've been doing these kinds of projects is that, it's not always that first conversation, but it's the conversation where somebody says, oh, go talk to so-and-so.
Right.
Go talk to so-and-so. And then you end up in these really, really kind of interesting, discussions. So, in Honduras, there were a couple of conversations that, every conversation that I had in Honduras, or I think on the book overall, it could fit into the narrative that I was painting, because through the book, I tried not to paint a simple narrative, right? Because immigration is complicated, and if anything, the challenge was to take something that's complicated and explain it hopefully well. But the one person that I wish I had figured out a way to drop in is he's the pastor of a church in Nueva Suyapa, which is a neighborhood in Tegucigalpa, kind of up on the hill. It's a very poor neighborhood. It's where an organization, founders that I've been working with there were living. And I sat down with this pastor who, as a young college student, had built some of the first housing in this neighborhood.
Yep.
And now is the community that had, slowly getting paved roads, was slowly getting cement homes. And he just had this, it was impossible to kind of capture his entire story in one conversation. It's almost like what he had done in this neighborhood and been a part of was about so much more than, that 1 hour conversation. So when I think about the stories I would have liked to include, I often kind of go to his.
Got it. So now we're going to shift to a criticism of mine.
Go for it.
But just know the question goes to, why am I wrong about this? So this is a short, again, close to the beginning of the book. But I think that the things about this that I'll refer to sort of repeat themselves over the course of the book. So this is on the treatment of the book on Trump and, by extension, Trump voters. In his infamous June 15, 2016, down the golden escalator speech, which it still blows. Sorry, this is not in your book. It blows my mind that the golden escalator scene is like a part of our politics. It's craziness. To announce his campaign for president, Trump never mentioned a border wall, but his perception of immigrants and immigration was quite clear. Quote, "When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best," he said. "They're not sending you," candidate Trump said to an audience that included a number of paid actors. They're sending, again, quote, "They're sending people that have lots of problems. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're bringing rapists," end quote. "More lies were to come," open quote. "They're sending us not the right people." And by the way, I'm going to cut in here again. You must have had a hell of a time dealing with having to include Trump quotes and the way that just they read in a book. Jesus Christ.
The man is in need of a copy editor.
I re-listened to our last interview, and I just it had been years now, and we at least agreed he's a piece of shit. Or I said it and you laughed. I took that as an agreement. More lies were to come. Quote, "They're sending us not the right people. It's coming from more than Mexico. It's coming from all over South and Latin America, and it's coming probably from the Middle East," end quote. The next line would define his campaign and his first term. Quote, "But we don't know because we have no protection and we have no competence. We don't know what's happening," end quote. Trump was intent on telling a story that bad people with bad intentions were coming from beyond our borders, unchecked, uncontrolled, and since we didn't know who it was, we needed a president to exert control, to protect the nation's residents, to protect national identity, to protect a way of life. Trump planted seeds of doubt that only he was brazen enough to harvest, seeds that over time informed and were informed by global conspiracy theories, seeds that sprouted a type of extremism that for years had been relegated to the dark recesses of the internet. By weaponizing immigration, Trump mainstreamed hate. And then later in the book, not too much later, someone is quoted as saying, and I took the way that the quote was framed as supporting an argument, the immigration system literally tries to break people. And I think this was in the context of immigration court proceedings. So it's not just a Trump question, but rather what comes to my mind when I read all that is, and let me preface this, I'm not saying that the inclusion of this line would have made Trump seem like some kind of a benevolent genius on immigration policy, but there is something to be said for a more charitable quoting of Trump, including the ludicrous and some I assume are good people.
Oh, yes.
You know. So what? Another thing that comes to mind, and I'm just going to throw all this stuff out there. You don't have to touch each one if you don't want to. One of the Trump campaign and conservative media's, sort of boogeymen, but also there was some amount of truth to it. They exacerbated, how much of a factor it was. But the idea of the Mexican government's sending people, right? I think a lot of people, again, especially if they were reading that quote charitably, took it more as a criticism of the Mexican government's handling of the migration that was moving toward the U.S. border than of Mexican people themselves, right? In other words, that the Mexican government was participating in, moving a certain element closer to the border. And then there's the thing of weaponizing immigration, mainstreaming hate. I don't doubt for a moment that immigration systems break people, but the government at all levels does things it's not literally trying to do, right?
Yeah.
Which, again, like this is the Liberated Podcast. I'm the crazy anarcho-capitalist guy. I mean, that's part of my beef with government is that no matter how good the intentions are, it's breaking people at least a little bit at all times, you know. So to me, one of the book's shortcomings is that it's maybe not as charitable as it could or should be, even in service of its own arguments, if that makes sense, right? It doesn't quite, in my view, and again, tell me why I'm wrong, I observed it as not necessarily steel-manning the other side's arguments enough to make it convincing to somebody who doesn't already agree with the premises. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, I mean, look, I ended up writing a lot more about Trump in this book than I ever expected or wanted to.
I think you wrote enough for what maybe 10 people wanted to write about.
Exactly. It was just it was not a healthy place. But I mean, when you look at the totality of what he did, from that speech coming down the escalator to the way that he stumbled upon border wall as a mnemonic device in the speech to rile up his crowds, to then in essence providing the political infrastructure and the political amplification to the messages coming from, you know, the far right, the alt-right that became the populism, nationalism, and now Christian nationalism. I am really hard-pressed to figure out a way to kind of look back on what Trump did and when it comes to immigration and be anything close to charitable. And I try to be, pretty clear-eyed about this stuff. But in the second half of the book, I also tell the stories of, you know, conservative voters who, as they're grappling with the way that, frankly, the person that they elected is treating their friends, their neighbors, their fellow church members, etc. So I think the conflict that they have in terms of thinking, okay, Trump is going to represent my interests on all these issues, but then he, you know, so wildly and so, extremely went against their interests in terms of treating immigrants. I think in that conflict, I hope that I'm providing a reader a sense of, okay, even if you're a Trump voter, it's okay to think about immigration in a different way.
Sure.
Right? And yeah, but I can't figure out a way. I could not figure out a way to kind of make Trump seem charitable when you look at the totality of what he did over the course of his administration.
Well, and I guess, and I wish that I had made note of the passages that this would apply to, but they were there, references to Trump voters or the Trump base, and I guess maybe taken in some, it's hard maybe to know when a criticism of Trump is and is not a criticism of the person who voted for Trump.
Yeah.
For clarity, I didn't vote for him in either election, but I know people who did, and and some of what you were saying, I think, you know, people who don't like his positions on immigration, you know, grappling with what he did and said is a good segue into a next question. But just another note on this, at least in my observation, I think that some of what he was tapping into, setting aside some of the more call him nasty, to use it's not a Trumpism, but Trump liked calling people nasty. Some of his nastier Trumpisms on immigration, I think, could just as easily read as or were tapping into a resentment not of immigrants, but of what some people perceived as their politicians giving attention to immigrants that should have been going to their needs, right?
Yeah.
And specifically illegal immigration,
right?
You know, and so I guess that's part of. It's a very soft sort of criticism in the sense that it's hard to pinpoint, but I guess that's part of what I mean by being charitable, not so much to Trump himself. I mean, frankly, I don't give a shit what Trump thinks about your book, but to the person who voted for Trump, and there is an element of, like, to say out loud that you voted for Trump in some circles is immediately to risk a lot, and that's kind of the person that I'm thinking of when I think.
Yeah, and as I wrote the book, you know, I wrote the book really over the course of 2019 and 20. Really kind of zeroed in on it at summer of 20, and then kind of finished it off, I would say, by the summer of 21. And so at that moment in time, as I think about this, you just saw, I mean, the Trump base has become something, a political power within the country.
Yeah.
And, you know, the folks who identify as Trump-based voters now, I don't think they're ever going to be in support of immigration and immigrants.
Can you... I wonder what you mean by Trump's base, right? Because I think the reason I say that, and I wonder what you mean, is because as a matter of politics, there's such a, I don't want to say polarization, because I don't see the two parties as necessarily being that far apart, but there's certainly a sharp division. And so I think that there are a lot of people who can be seen as his base in the sense that they're reliable voters, but not necessarily his base in the sense that they're like the most gung-ho, MAGA flag waving types, if that makes sense. So when you talk about his base, in some sense, I think there are people in his base who could be very sympathetic to the immigration arguments and who will never vote against him if he's the Republican candidate.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think this is, I think there are a number of people, particularly of faith, who would identify as Trump-based voters, Catholic or evangelical, white or Hispanic, and they likely disagree with him or are deeply uncomfortable with his rhetoric and policies when it comes to immigration.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think as long as neither the Democrats or other parts of the Republican Party are providing those people a place to go, they're going to remain a part of that Trump base. And they're going to find their identity, they're going to find their community in that constellation of voters. And I think that, you know, people have to wrestle with their choices, right?
Sure.
And that's I think what comes out over and over again, and it came out during the Afghan evacuation. I think comes out quite a bit in, you know, the current Ukrainian crisis, is that people are grappling with, okay, what does it mean to welcome the stranger versus having such a deeply set political identity?
Right. So I think one of the areas of the book where the book has the most success, at least, or it's a weird way to put it, one of the areas where the book is sort of strongest is in portraying the more complicated and yet in a way simpler, less heated and sometimes hate-fueled realities of immigration and policy implications. Its approach to business owners, in particular ones like those Idaho dairymen, who, despite their being on the conservative, side of things, deal so directly with immigrants, and in particular immigrants who are in the country illegally, and who, as a result, there are holes in immigration law that they know aren't accounting for the reality of how immigration happens and how those exchanges of and what the demand for labor looks like and what the cultures look like in all these places. So the story, just for the benefit of the listener, feel free to correct me or add or whatever, that I'm referring to is that at a time when people in Twin Falls, Idaho, seemed afraid of an influx of refugees because of how certain media were telling the immigration and terrorism stories, Idaho dairymen who understood immigration and immigrants in a more personal way become allies of the immigration cause, again, despite there being more on the conservative side of the spectrum. So tell me more about the interactions that you have with people who are in those positions, right? And what are those interactions like, and what do they have to teach us? Maybe not even just about immigration, right? Just in general about that sort of coalition building. Yeah.
So the Idaho Dairymen Association, at that point, was run by Bob Narabout. He was born, I think, or grew up by and large in Michigan, ended up in Utah, and then in Idaho, probably about 15, 20 years to run the association. And it's interesting hanging out with the dairymen. I've come to know more about dairy than I ever thought I would. And I don't know a lot, but still, it's, I'm still surprised by what I do know.
A little sidebar, do you enjoy that aspect of it? Like having these little pockets of your work where you get to sort of geek out on milk or whatever?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's had some strange dairy conversations. So in any case, this is a community whose families, by and large, immigrated to the States after World War II from, I believe, the Netherlands. And a lot of them were pushed off their land. A lot of them were fleeing the consequences of World War II. So when they saw how Latino immigrants were being treated in Twin Falls, much less refugees, they realized that they had to do something. So my interactions with, the dairymen is often, at a diner in Twin Falls, sitting down over a lot of cups of coffee, kind of talking about their dairies. And this is the thing that always comes through is that, you got to milk a cow twice a day, 365 days a year. So these dairymen who don't have big operations, this is not big business for them. They're working side to side with these guys, whether they're from Mexico or Honduras or elsewhere, for a long, long time. So every interaction with a dairyman or their family is kind of a discussion about their extended family who immigrated from a different country. So there's a humanity to it, and there's still a political conflict because, again, a lot of your Idaho dairymen, they voted for Donald Trump on environmental issues, on economic issues, on government issues.
And they may vote for him again.
Right. Right. Idaho, I think 70%, 80% for Trump, right?
But even those individuals,
Right.
Right.
But for them, it was kind of that dissonance, right? Of, okay, I voted for this guy, but at the end of the day, he is treating my coworker in a really, really harmful way.
So, you got close to those stories. Maybe I'm weird and maybe you're kind of weird, but I think that's a lot more interesting.
Yep.
Forget whether it's useful or helpful or even just from a standpoint of being a compelling story. It's so much more interesting than the bullshit that you see on your CNNs or your Fox Newses or, in the wilder side, your Democracy Nows and your OANs.
Right.
As somebody who is in this advocacy work, I'm sure you do a lot of pitching. I'm sure you talk to a lot of media trying to get them to tell certain stories. What's your sense of why we don't hear more about that sort of thing, right? About that person who, maybe it is because it's such a niche, right? Mm-hmm. But that person who has this story to tell with very clear implications about solutions. Is the cynical answer the true one, that they're just more interested in the endless conflict of,
I don't think we can only blame the media here. I think we also have to blame the people who are reading the media, and they're the ones clicking on that story. So it kind of becomes this vicious cycle of, you do a political story because somebody wants to read it, and they'll share it, and you do another political story. So, it's kind of a, where there's a demand, there will be a supply. So the question is actually, how do you change the demand for political polarization stories versus, human stories of why policies are not meeting the needs of dairymen.
Right.
And, for us at the forum, a lot of what we try to do is always trying to, for example, we'll do a press event that will have 2 or 3 national kind of political people, but, we'll often invite the Idaho dairymen to be a part of that conversation. So a lot of it is kind of providing just a bridge between what's happening in Idaho and a national reporter. And then that national reporter says, okay, this is a thread that I want to pull. And then, when that story comes out as an advocacy organization, it's on us then to amplify it as much as possible so that you're changing both the supply of the stories and then the demand for the stories.
Sure. It feels a little bit to me like you're not wanting to be too harshly critical of.
But I guess it's it's easy to be critical of the media, right?
Well, so let me frame it differently. Rather than why won't they? What have you found to be successful in getting a story like that?
Okay, that's fair. Oftentimes it's as simple as making the introduction and saying, "Hey, Washington Post reporter, this is how the Idaho dairy industry is impacted by a broken immigration system. This is a key influencer in Idaho who can introduce you to 5 different dairymen and their workers." Yep. So a lot of it is just kind of straight up connections. But I do think we have to kind of think about this as both a supply problem and a demand problem. And changing the culture of communities, whether they're liberal or conservative, to be asking for a different way to be explained policy and politics. There's a great essay out there by Amanda Ripley called Complicating the Narrative, in which it's actually along these lines. And she makes the point that every time a journalist says, we've got to keep it simple, all journalist is doing is kind of keeping the actual story and the nuance of the story out. And ultimately, people are smart. and they see these things in a very complicated way. And if we provide them complicated stories that, capture all the nuance, people will arrive at a better conclusion. They don't have to be told what to conclude.
Sure.
Right? They can say, okay, and now I see how this is all complicated in different ways.
Yeah. I still think I'm still more comfortable putting more of the blame on me, and I think part of it is business decisions.
Yeah.
Right. I think it's easier, and because it's cheaper to spend 5 minutes on, what, a minority and majority leader in the House tweeted at each other, than it is to send somebody out to Idaho and talk to dairymen for 2 days.
Yep.
Certainly there's an element of that sort of public demand.
Yeah.
I do think that I think that media sort of shapes the demand a little bit.
I'm not saying it's one or the other. I'm just saying that I'm just trying to make a case that it's both.
Yeah.
And I just think that both media and the consumers of media have a real lack of curiosity for the rest of the country.
Sure. So I'm going to move away from the book,
okay.
But of course, feel free to relate any of this back to the book or whatever. So we'll get into some of the freedom stuff.
Yep.
Now that we've kind of given people that background of what the book is. So let's start with the big sort of 10,000 foot,
yep.
Philosophical question. So setting aside the particulars of what U.S. policy is and isn't, or has and hasn't been, what's your view of what people's rights are as it relates to immigration, right? And feel free to get into how you view rights more broadly and all that. But if government at its best has the purpose of safeguarding rights, which at least in the American tradition is seen as the purpose. If the purpose of government is to safeguard the exercise of rights, we have to understand what those rights even are. So in that context, what rights are we even talking about in your view?
So I think it was in the 1950s. It was Roosevelt's wife who cajoled the rest of the world to join the U.S. in signing on to the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And I don't remember, off the top of my head, right? But in essence, it's kind of the freedom to move. But for me, it was also what's striking about it is that it's one of the few statements of that kind of scope that uses the term dignity and treating people with dignity. The word dignity isn't part of the U.S. Constitution, right? It is. Thank you. So, I think freedom for, what are the rights that an immigrant has? Immigrants do not have a right to enter a country that is not their own, right? Every country has the right to secure their border and regulate who can enter and who cannot enter. But I do think that immigrants have some fundamental human right of being treated with dignity. And in fact, the original subtitle of the book was Crossing Borders, Restoring America's Dignity. And because what I found is that our policies predating Trump, certainly under Trump and even now, our immigration policies really strip the dignity from migrants. And along the way, I think those policies, by stripping dignity of migrants, strips the dignity of the country and all of us. Because our policies as a country, I think, are an extension of our values. So I think the right that any person should have is to be treated with dignity by the systems that they engage with.
Is there any element of being treated with dignity that has implications for what your movement looks like? I mean, I would say for myself, right, and I'm as a general rule, I don't try to hide where I am. I do think that people have a right to cross borders, and that any restrictions on that are necessarily a sort of a limitation of people's exercise of the rights that exist before our government. Even the UN Declaration, I think, is useful insofar as it's a statement of some consensus of its members, but I don't know that it goes quite far enough, because there are members who consented to that declaration that are in the habit of violating people's rights.
Right.
So I, at the risk of sounding like I'm just sort of repeating the question, at what point? This is a good transition. So You mentioned a country having a right to set the restrictions.
Yep.
I have to think that at some point a country can set the bar so high for entry that there's a violation not only of the rights, and I think this is part of where the dairymen are such a useful case, right? Mm-hmm. Not only of the rights of the migrant, but of the person the migrant is coming to exchange with.
Yep.
So in that sense, like just independent of, and maybe this is why I was saying, feel free to get into how you see rights, right?
Yep.
But at least in my view, the right exists, predates the state that is formed to protect it. So how do you see that side of it?
Mm-hmm. So how do I see
the assuming, and maybe you don't, but assuming that you agree that the right is separate from the law designed to protect it, how do you see the right that the law is that the law would in an ideal world protect perfectly?
Right. So I mean, this is kind of natural rights versus right.
Correct. Yeah.
So actually, for the first book, I had this great conversation with Archbishop Wensky of here in South Florida, and he went into this entire idea of kind of natural rights. And if you frame it that way, if you ask the question, what is somebody's natural rights? It's to live, right? To be able to live to their fullest potential, ensure their children and their families are safe. And I mean, look, when somebody's natural rights are violated, they are going to move to another place so that they can be safe. They can move to their fullest potential. And that, I mean, look, I mean, that's the inherent tension of any government, right? Is the rights bestowed by a government versus the natural rights of any one human being. And, I think we just have to kind of, you need systems that can operate in that tension. And right now, the immigration system, it avoids that tension completely.
Yeah. To what
Does
extent?
that make sense?
I think so. Yeah. You made some references to the system and its failure to protect people's dignity. Mm-hmm. Would you say? And I don't want to focus on Trump, although you can, in whatever your answer is. Would you say that its failure to protect people's dignity is a consequence of execution or a consequence of the rules themselves? So take, for example, separation of families at the border. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find anybody who doesn't find the effect on an individual level horrific. And yet I do find compelling, at least in terms of where I'm pointing my finger, right? Not am I okay with it, but where am I pointing my finger? I do find a pretty compelling argument to be that the law says certain things about what to do with adults and what to do with minors, and you end up in this inevitable gross situation of separating families if you are to comply with the law. And so I do think, for me, not that, okay, well, let's let this continue, but rather, who am I angry at? I think that has pretty serious implications.
So I guess I would say is that Trump was making and look, let me put it this way. Any president, any policymaker, any person who's responsible for following the law is making a series of moral choices along the way. Because you can comply with immigration law like Obama did, Biden has done, in terms of securing the border, detaining and deporting people who are not eligible for asylum, and you can kind of stop at that place, right? Trump went, again, within the confines of the law, he made a moral decision to say, okay, I believe that if I separate parents from their children, that will deter future migrants from making the trip, right? But Obama made a lot of decisions with the same goal of trying to deter migration. Obama was not successful, neither was Trump. Because even under the Trump administration, we saw very, very high numbers of border apprehensions. So when you ask the question, okay, who do we actually blame? Who should we be angry at? We should wonder, okay, who is benefiting from this system? It's clearly not the immigrant, right? That immigrant is paying, I talked to folks in Honduras, right? They're paying $10,000, $12,000, $14,000 to a cartel to try to get to the U.S. alive just to ask for asylum. It is certainly not the dairyman, right?
Right.
It's certainly not a CBP officer who is processing kids when they would rather be pursuing drug smugglers. You can go. The list of people who are losing here goes on and on and on. The only entity I believe that's winning right now is organized crime, because that cartel has managed to figure out how to monetize the movement of people and the movement of drugs from Central America or further south to the U.S.-Mexico border.
Well, it's like, I mean, I think people too often separate immigration and human movement as if it applied by different rules. But any case of prohibition, organized crime, if you're prohibiting movement across, a particular line, anybody who wants to break that law, that's where you end up.
They will find somebody to pay.
They benefit from the drug war. They benefited from prohibition of alcohol. It's the same deal.
So, but I mean, in this case, one of the fastest ways to address a labor shortage in the U.S. To reduce pressure at the U.S.-Mexico border would to be actually create the ample number of legal immigration visas so that Honduran is paying the U.S. government thousands of dollars to get legal entry to the United States and not paying a cartel.
Sure.
And then that allows people to say, okay, there's control at the border, our resources are being prioritized, and we actually have a system that is clear, that's transparent, that is, breaking fewer people.
Yeah.
Right.
I guess I end up being of, and this is the last thing that I want to say there, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on. I'm sort of torn. I'm of two minds, because on the one hand, again, as the crazy anarchist, in the room, they're unjust laws, and I don't think that people have a moral obligation to abide by unjust laws.
Yeah.
And yet, if we're talking about the people who are in the position to actually enforce laws, a part of me wants to see them enforce the law to the letter in the way that arguably a Trump administration, not because there's some inherent good, but because unless that's happening, the laws that we're allowing to stay on the books become sort of an abstraction. In a way, I think Trump's border policies did more to move conservatives in the direction of wanting to see those policies, at least in my anecdotal experience, of wanting to see those policies change than, say, Obama's DACA actions did, or, for example, right? There's something about seeing the consequences, as with, say, the drug war. Like, do I want to see cops not enforce drug law? Sort of, but then on the other hand, does that delay all these legalizations?
Right, but the premise of your concern, I think, is off, because neither Obama nor Biden neither of them are not enforcing the law at the border. They are just making the decision to say, okay, we're going to, we have this strategy within the architecture of the law to deter migration by detaining and deporting people as quickly as possible. That is, again, kind of within the implementation of the law. Then there is this other option, that Trump made to then say he was going to separate families. But I don't think we can sit here and say that Biden and Obama have not, and I'm not defending them. I'm
sure,
just, right? They have enforced the law. And I mean, I think in any law, there is a series of choices that the implementer has.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of, say, DACA, I hear deferred action and I hear punting enforcement, because I don't want to deal with changing the underlying law. And I also don't want to enforce the thing. I mean, you were talking earlier about who benefits from these things. Yes, organized crime, but also it's the people who have electoral ways to profit from this, right? I mean, if you can win votes, then you'll do, which motivates a huge chunk of all this. So in that sense, I would kind of push back. I mean, deferred action is ultimately a euphemism for not enforcing right now. Hopefully somebody else will have to do it.
But so, a cop on the street here, any cop anywhere has to decide, okay, where are they going to spend their resources, right? Are they going to spend their resources on the person, jaywalking, or the person who's committed a violent crime, right? And there's a limited set of valuable law enforcement resources. So in the immigration context, deferred action is in essence saying that a young person is signing up for deportation, but as a nation, we have made the decision that they are a net benefit to the country to have that action deferred. So they're right? So,
Well, yeah, no, I agree. That is ostensibly the reasoning. I still think that there's some politicking there. There's a political motivation from the people who would put that policy in place. But I agree. But I think that if that's the case, I still think there's something to be said for.
But hold on, so this is what doesn't make sense to me. If
What's the timeline of DACA?
Right. Before we get there, I'm sorry. I want to try to understand what you're saying.
Sure.
Here. Yeah. Because on one hand, you're saying that an individual, if it's an unjust law, a person is not morally obligated to abide by it.
Sure. Yes.
Right.
Correct.
But if it is a law, if the same law is unjust, then the implementer of the policy is morally obligated to implement it to the fullest hilt.
Well, and this is why I was acknowledging that I'm torn on the issue. Right?
Okay.
So I don't want to use the language of the implementer is obligated to enforce it. I'm speaking more to what the consequences of that enforcement might be. Mm-hmm. And I'm kind of separating at the risk of saying, I just said I didn't want to use it, but let's just go with obligations of the institutions.
Yep.
Because unless the institutions are doing what they have a black and white, not abstract political mandate, but a black and white mandate to do, unless they're actually doing that, then the rules become an abstraction. And what I'm saying is that I think if the institutions functioned the way that the black and white rules say they ought to function, then citizens are more in a position to understand in clear terms what the impacts of those rules are and whether they ought to be changed. But if this is maybe you've brought me to a clear articulation of my issue with DACA, is so long as we have this sort of conception of the executive as someone who, as long as there's a general sense that we don't like the thing, then the rule stays on the book to come bite us in the ass later. It just seems to me like it just delays our addressing the root problem of the law whose enforcement we're delaying.
Totally agree with you. And, I think that Congress has absolved itself of pretty much any responsibility when it comes to immigration policy, because whether you're a Democrat or Republican, in this day and age, you have a lot more to benefit from politically by keeping the polarization high when it comes to immigration. Democrats have no incentive, or I should say little incentive. Republicans have little incentive to actually try to find compromise solutions because their bases are driving them to corners. So as a result, the executive branch is kind of caught in between kind of a rock and a hard place.
Okay. So, kind of along in that same vein, Martha Bueno, who's the only guest we've published with at the time of this recording, I forget whether we discussed her, but I'll just, for the benefit of the person listening, Martha Bueno is currently running for a Miami-Dade County Commission seat. She is running without party affiliation, but was most recently, she's on a community council for, I believe, Kendall, and she did Hispanic outreach for Joe Jorgensen's Libertarian campaign. So I was listening to an interview that she did on a podcast that I had not heard of before, but that apparently is a thing in libertarian circles, called The Liberty Lockdown, which I think, if I remember the guy's story correctly, it's called that because of, I guess it was born in COVID, and it was like a liberty conversation spurred by COVID lockdowns or whatever. The host is Clint Russell, so I'm just noting all that in case somebody wants to go listen to it. Don't know the guy. The two of them kind of clashed a little bit on the subject of immigration, where I was more on Team Martha in this exchange, but I think that he probably did a better job of articulating his position, where the argument from Clint, as I understood it, was that in light of the commons, that people own, which already I take issue with this idea of a public ownership of this commons. However much we might not like restrictions on immigration, we've got to live with them so long as that immigration has implications for the commons. Because I see these rights as being naturally occurring ones, I don't see one as being subsidiary to the other, and I think, sort of along the same lines, right? Like I would rather see this influx of migrants, and if it puts too much of a strain on the system, maybe that'll teach you not to design the system that way if you want to be such a nation of immigrants.
Right.
But what's your view of that broadly, right? Without getting into, I know that touches on some of the arguments of the anti-immigration crowd or whatever, whether people are getting welfare, but just in a very broad sense, whatever country we might be in, expand a little on what you were saying about a country's right to set those terms,
yep.
and where you see those lines, and its relationship to that idea of sort of a communal ownership of what we're letting people into.
So I just recently wrote an essay for Comment magazine. It's a faith-based magazine, comes out quarterly, and the theme of this particular issue was spheres, civic spheres. Schools, politics, the different spheres of our lives that we operate in, religion, etc. And as I was writing the piece, the idea of subsidiarity came up. And this is in essence the idea that decisions should be as localized as possible, and should not solely be kind of a top-down kind of decision, right?
Yeah.
And immigration is really interesting in this way because immigration, according to the Constitution, is under the purview of Congress to set limits, right? Set levels. But the way that immigration plays out is so localized that communities feel like they are being robbed of their agency in making these decisions. So, therefore, as a result, you have just this. I think immigration plays an outsized role in undermining the trust that the public has for Congress, because people see their communities changing. They say it's the immigration system. It's, quote, the open border, and that's the fault of Congress and or the president. And as I wrote in the essay, as a result, I think what happens is there's a radical subsidiarity where people, they're not only making a decision, they don't only want a decision of who can or cannot come into the country, but who can or cannot come into their community. Right? And I think that we have lost that balance between subsidiarity, where local communities are owning and understanding decisions that are being made, and then having a Congress or a federal government that can listen to community A versus community C and say, okay, this is a compromise path that addresses the needs across the board. Doesn't get everybody everything they want.
Sure.
But, I mean, as long as things remain so divided, that sense of radical subsidiarity, I fear, is going to grow when it comes to immigration.
Sure. On that national policymaking front, one of the phrases that at least for like my entire adult life and then some for sure, we keep hearing is comprehensive immigration reform. I can't shake the thought, and maybe it's just a product of like my having grown up in the media environment that I did. I'm 35, so where like all of these national stories are just so in your face all the time. Like my whole it's difficult for me to think of immigration as a topic without thinking of the phrase comprehensive immigration reform. And I can't shake the thought that wouldn't we have made more progress in making people freer, right, to cross borders, to engage with people who need to cross borders for that engagement to happen, if the reform just weren't so comprehensive, right? If the reform were like, what if we, like, let's take the dairy farmers as an example, like, wouldn't more movement happen if, and wouldn't it be easier to find consensus if the laser focus were just, what if the process of letting somebody in to do temporary work didn't have as a condition of it that work be seasonal? Mm-hmm. And it just seems to, like, that would impact so many lives in so many places, in so many industries, right? Because it's not just a dairy thing. Even just Miami, right? Miami restaurant business isn't seasonal, but Miami's a place that there's so many restaurants that you do not need to speak English in. So much tourism where English is not a necessity, and tourism is seasonal even if the business doesn't close, after peak season. So that's what I'm asking you to respond to, is just what would you say to the idea of what if we took it slower, might we move faster?
Yeah. I mean, look, as one of the people who was shouting very loudly comprehensive immigration reform, in 2006, 7, 13, 10, 13, 14. Looking back, I'm not sure that was the problem, is trying to put too many reforms into one place. In most cases, in every legislative debate around comprehensive immigration reform, things didn't really fall apart around legalization undocumented. Things didn't fall apart around the enforcement measures. Those, deals were struck. Where each bill falls apart is when we talk about the future of legal immigration and how many people we as a country should let in. And I think that, comprehensive or incremental over the course of time, I think the bigger issue is we were having a policy debate and the rest of the country was having a cultural debate.
It's interesting that you say that about the future of legal immigration, because the way, and I'm not saying that you're wrong. As an outsider to the issue, it looked to me like it fell apart around what to do about people who had already crossed the border and were here illegally.
No.
Because every time that you see, say, especially conservative media coverage of it, the sticking point is amnesty, or perceived amnesty, but whatever it is they're calling amnesty is the thing they're up in arms about.
But so that's the political debate. But even outside, so you had that political debate of, legalization versus citizenship versus deport them all, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that took up 80% of the oxygen of the debate.
Yeah.
But when you actually talk to the people who are in the room, it would always come down to the negotiation of how many work visas should ag have versus high tech versus et cetera. And that's where the vote coalitions would really start to fall apart.
Okay.
Because we were, again, as advocates and even as lawmakers, all of us were having a debate about policy and numbers, and the rest of the country was asking the question, why is my community changing so much?
So my question still sort of stands, right? Because it's a different problem than I went in thinking of, but I still see it as a problem of the comprehensive nature, because what you're telling me is that because it was a comprehensive proposal, right? I was about to use the Spanish entre comillas. Because the proposal was comprehensive, it ended up creating this separation between the public debate and what's happening in that room. So wouldn't there be a potential for more movement if the whole country were having that conversation, whether it was about the number of visas or the nature of the visas, right? Because you could have you could similarly have this it's going to be so many visas, but from here on out, seasonality has nothing to do with it. If you want to use your visa to bring somebody in for a month versus 12, whatever. So again, wouldn't there be a benefit to the public political debate being the same as the one being had in that room?
So I think we're coming up on that moment where I think that this year there is a opportunity for Democrats and Republicans to work together to address the situation of the border, to legalize dreamers, and to repair the farm workforce of the agricultural sector immigration programs.
Okay.
All three measures have existing bipartisan pieces of legislation. They are large enough to serve significant needs at the border and internally. Put your toe in the water of future legal immigration with the ag sector program, the farm worker program. But like you said, they help the public understand that it's okay, we can fix this system. And it means that the next thing should be a little bit easier. I do think we're at that place where that sort of a shift in legislative strategy is needed.
Yeah. Have you seen, kind of along the same lines of the conversations that are happening in those rooms that so many of us are not connected to or privy to, I wonder whether in those conversations, in those, negotiations or pitches or whatever the scenario might be, where have you seen, if at all, the argument of this is actually about Americans' freedom to engage with immigrants, right? It seems to me that that's something that is too seldom used to win over, say, conservatives, even some libertarians. Like I was just saying, right? I'm a flavor of libertarianism that's like, of course. If I've got a thing in the same way that, I mean, the internet is a wild place. Like every time that I have photo editing work I need done, I send it to the same person in Bangladesh, and it's like we're kind of getting to know each other over Upwork.com. Yeah, it's this wild thing. I should be able to do the same thing, in MeetSpace. Have you seen that be successful at all? And if so, what spaces is it where people kind of get it and where that's being communicated?
So, Paul, when I was researching Crossing Borders, I ran across this author. Paul Waldman he writes a lot about religion, in particular religious liberty, and he had this amazing point where, if I remember it correctly, where he makes the case that when you look over the history of the country, attacks on religious liberty are often kind of begin with attacks on immigration, if I get that right.
Okay.
So,
in other words, that certain groups of immigrants tend to correlate with a certain faith or whatever.
Right. So, the Catholics, right, Muslims, and you would see an influx of immigrants who, in essence, were not Protestant, and you would kind of create this dissonance between, okay, as a country we believe in religious liberty, but then as a country we have these deep-seated cultural fears of other religions. So in that tension, right? So then, to get to your question of, what does it mean, I guess, to like have a systems that guarantee liberties, right? And how are people called to do that? I think one of the most important kind of facets of that is religious liberty. In fact, in 2000, I want to say 16-ish, there was an effort in South Carolina to, close the refugee resettlement program. And it was faith communities, churches, who said, you know what, according to our religion, we should be able to resettle refugees. So for them, it was a religious liberty question. In fact, in Texas, just over the last couple of months, there was a lawsuit filed by the Catholic diocese against Governor Abbott when he started to, in essence, impinge on their religious liberty to care for unaccompanied children. So that question of liberty, I think, is really powerful, particularly when it comes to a person's ability to practice their faith.
That's an interesting... I'm not even going to try to form some kind of a position on it, but what's interesting to me about it that I had not heard that religious liberty argument before is that there's the weird thought that comes to mind is, I mean, I get it. There being a religion or a faith-based obligation to participate in society in a particular way, and yet because there's this odd, private sector faith community involvement in this state process of regulating immigration, it's almost like the implication. I know this isn't it, but it's almost like the implication is like, well, for us to exercise our religion, you need to continue to supply us with unaccompanied minors. Like, it's something that I know that barely makes sense, but it's a thing that I'm sure I'll be chewing on in my head for a while, like whether that's how that religious liberty argument.
But from there, it's kind of along the lines of what we were talking about earlier. It is a natural part of being a human being, and being a person of faith is to care for your neighbor.
Sure.
And so I think that from the perspective of conservative faith communities, they don't necessarily see, the government supplying them unaccompanied children to care for.
Of course, yeah.
Right? They see that a child is presenting for protection at the border, and they are in a position, and they feel it's their responsibility to provide that protection.
Right.
And when a government stands in the way of them being able to do that, that's when they feel like their religious liberty is being impinged upon.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me. I wish that more people had a sense of how where the weight is born, and how the task of resettling refugees is carried out, because I don't know, especially that a lot of conservatives quite understand what a model it could be for the country they'd like to see, of so much community involvement in shaping their realities, right? It's I don't know that there's another corner of American life that functions quite that way, in that very immediate jump from the public sector to and then the private sector is implementing.
Yep.
Whatever.
And in fact, Canada a number of years ago put together a program. It's kind of a community sponsorship program where, in essence, families can sponsor individual refugee families instead of having to go through an organization. And the Biden administration has brought that program online here in the States. In fact, I think it was just recently they announced in their effort to welcome 100,000 Ukrainian refugees that by and large it would be through that community sponsorship program.
Yeah.
But, I just think it's a really powerful program that provides people kind of a direct experience and direct ownership of that process.
Yeah. So we're the last thing I want to get into now that we're on the subject of refugees is something that you touched on earlier about whether a refugee is seeking refuge from some sort of state aggression as opposed to the danger of living in proximity to cartels or whatever. Talk a bit about. Let's start with, for the benefit of the listener, defining what the current definition is. Who qualifies for refugee status now?
Give me a second. I'll pull it up.
Sure.
I'll read it.
And in the meantime, while you're pulling it up, the reason that I ask is that I do think, and this is something that's very close to us here in Miami, I think that there's some confusion around, at least in a legal sense, who refugee status applies to.
Yep.
Whether it should apply more broadly is a separate question, but I think that it's one of those topics where you end up with a lot of people who feel very strongly about things they don't quite understand very well, and they end up just yelling at each other about nothing in particular. So, how does this function?
So, a refugee, according to U.S. law, is, number one, someone located outside of the U.S., is, number two, a special humanitarian concern to the U.S., number three, and this is the important part, demonstrates that they are persecuted or fear persecution due to race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group, is not firmly resettled in another country, and is admissible to the U.S.
Okay.
So, the way that refugee law, as I understand it, the precedence of it, kind of based on this theory, is that by and large, people's fear of persecution is by a state. So the challenge in a place like Honduras, for example, is it is the corruption and the ineptitude of the state that then allows a cartel to persecute individuals. And, then there's a case to be made that women who are victims of domestic violence should be able to seek asylum status here in the U.S. So that's why I think that, we haven't talked about, the growing body of work and thinking around climate refugees, and people are pushed out of their countries because of, climate incidents. So I think people are becoming refugees for reasons beyond the current definition. So we have to update the definition.
So I was in before you said we have to update the definition. Until the definition is updated, do you see the disconnect that I see in the public understanding of what constitutes legally refugee status? Because it seems like there are so many people who believe that something is going wrong when, let's say, a Honduran migrant who fears the general climate of violence where they're from is not granted refugee status. And they think not only that it's immoral, but that a law is being broken somewhere. It has to be because, and if I'm understanding correctly, it's not. And where the troubling breakdown to me is that there aren't enough mainstream voices. Of course, you're out there, and the forum is out there, and other groups like that, sort of correcting that. Yeah. Because if the perception was more rooted in the reality of what the law is, or what the policy is, or whatever, we might be able to go about addressing those sort of structural issues.
Yeah.
Otherwise, and I think that there is also a section of our politics that capitalizes on some of that ignorance and almost uses, that idea of, well, they're refugees from this violence as sort of a cute political workaround that they know will never actually result in that person getting refugee status. And it just riles people up at each other. The reason that I was saying that we're so close to it here is that this is a conversation that happens often in Miami, where Cubans do get refugee status because it is a state issue. And I think that very often, this happened recently with, oh God, who was it? I might cut out me trying to think of this, but, it was DeSantis. DeSantis was in some meeting where clearly it was a little bit of a lot of bit of a pandery thing, where he was talking to a Cuban-American audience, maybe somewhere in Little Havana, and he made a big issue of, that these migrants are not refugees. And so little of the outrage that I would hear about it was, well, but they should be. And it was more like, well, these Cubans are just trying to separate themselves, like they think they're better and they want a different. It's like, no, that's not the issue. Like, there are actual refugees legally, and they're like, Cubans aren't like, trying to be part of some exclusive club with the Somalians or something like that. That's not what's going on here. So yeah, I guess this is all a very like gibberish loaded way of asking, what would you like to see that look like? And is the idea of it moving forward in sort of the more distant future, is the concept of a refugee even all that useful?
So let me answer the first question, or last question first. Yes, I think it is incredibly important that we as a nation hold on to or hold dear the definition of a refugee and having a refugee resettlement system. So that way, whether the situation is Syria, Ukraine, or Afghanistan, or whatever comes next, it is a process through which people can find protection. And they don't have to qualify for immigration based on work or family. Right? So that's the big difference between refugee status and immigration status, or immigrant status, is that immigrant status, you are an immigrant coming on a family-based visa, or non-immigrant coming based on work visa, right? But refugees they're coming because they're of a humanitarian concern to the U.S. So I think it's fundamental that we hold on to that. But the thing is that the majority of folks at the U.S.-Mexico right now who are from Central America, they're going to apply for asylum. They're very likely not going to receive asylum status and become refugees. But for them, it is one of the only ways that they can apply to enter the United States legally. Right? So what has happened at the U.S.-Mexico border is that our asylum system, in essence, has been kind of overrun by the cartels to become a legal immigration system. So that's why I always come back to, if we want to relieve that pressure, we actually have a functioning legal immigration system.
And that's part of why I'm saying, is the concept even all that useful? Because if you of course, just going to pick a country at random, a Swedish millionaire who just decided he'd rather spend more time, in his New York City condo, is not a refugee. But at some point, if you can be a refugee from your government's ineptitude of protecting you from violence, from the climate itself, from all of these things, at some point we've diluted the concept of refugee status that I wonder whether, and granted, now we're talking about like in this distant future, but like as a category, is it useful to have rather than just have some, program that doesn't make that kind of a distinction and just says, okay, for X amount of time, we have such and such a policy toward this population from this country, and the law that puts that in place just says because of the war.
Yeah, so I mean that would require Congress, in essence, to set up a visa program that, either they have the political ability to change quickly. I don't see that happening in my lifetime.
Oh, and I'm setting aside any of the political realities that this would have to deal with. I'm just saying in terms of like if you and I were playing immigration Minecraft right now.
But I think like the refugee status, it provides people a way to seek protection so that they don't have to kind of fit other criteria. Sure. And I just think that's really important. And I just think that the way the world is changing, we need to take another look at the way what are the criteria that people need to meet to qualify as refugees? The world has changed.
So last question, and then of course we can get if you have anything else that we didn't touch on, but you got your magic immigration law wand.
Yep.
You can make one of those sort of laser targeted things, whether it's because it seems important or it would have the deepest impact. Like, what is the thing that you could snap your fingers, wave your wand, and change overnight?
I gotta say, I would, if there's one thing that I would say we do, it's legalize the 10, 11 million undocumented.
Okay.
I just think this is a community that has lived in a pretty precarious situation for majority of them have been here for well over a decade. Their lives are incredibly unstable. And if I had one thing that I think we could do or need to do that's good for the country, it would be that. And I think the ability of unscrupulous employers to exploit them and anybody else who works alongside them would plummet. I think their families would thrive if there was just that greater sense of stability. And I think that, however many restaurants in the country who employ undocumented immigrants, they would breathe a pretty big sigh of relief.
Sure. So unless there's anything else that you want to get into other than this food that's been sitting on the table.
That I've been eating.
Yeah, right. Go ahead and tell people where they can find you, your book, all your things.
So you can find more information about the National Immigration Forum at immigrationforum.org. We are a nonpartisan immigration advocacy organization that I think has some of the smartest staff who are really thinking about these issues in a creative way. And then you can find out more about crossing borders at alinoorani.org. And there, we've got a bunch of stuff up there in terms of recent podcast interviews, media interviews, etc., as well as other things that I've written. And you can find a number of links to purchase Crossing Borders. Thank you.
Good stuff. As far as our shameless plugs, this is the Liberated Podcast. Give us all your money at patreon.com/DADEMAG, DADEMAG. You'll be supporting not only this, but also Bangkong Podcast, Step Into the Sandbox, the DADE Blind Tastings, and all sorts of other things that we do that we like to think are worth listening to and watching. Maybe we're wrong. I don't know. Give me your money anyway. DADEMAG.com/liberated. And also, if you have not already, subscribe and review the Liberated Podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Facebook. That's it. That's all I got. Thank you, Ali.
Hey, thank you, man. I really appreciate it.